The sun was a familiar, comforting weight on Elias's shoulders. It was the kind of late afternoon sun that had baked the same patch of earth for his entire life, and for his father's life before him. At 50-something years old, Elias was a man shaped by the land he worked. His hands were calloused maps of his labor, his face a leathered record of every season under the open sky. He wasn't a man of grand thoughts or complex plans. His world was measured in the cycles of planting and harvesting, in the health of his livestock, the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat against the quiet backdrop of the countryside. Today was like any other day. He had just finished mending a section of fence where a post had rotted through, the smell of fresh-cut pine and sweat mingling in the warm air. He was leaning on his shovel, taking a moment to just be, to watch his few cows graze lazily in the lower pasture. Everything was as it should be. The world was in its proper order. Then it was. Not with a bang, but with a deep, low groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. It was a sound so out of place that Elias straightened up, his hand tightening on the worn wooden handle of his shovel. The cows, too, lifted their heads, their chewing paused. Their eyes wide with a primitive alarm he could feel in his own gut. A strange stillness fell over the farm, as if all the birds and insects had suddenly decided to hold their breath. Elias felt a vibration through the soles of his worn work boots. A subtle shudder at first, like a heavy truck passing on a distant road. But it didn't pass. It grew. The ground beneath his feet began to roll, a sickening liquid motion that had no place on solid land. He stumbled, his legs suddenly feeling like they were made of straw. He grabbed onto the fence post he had just fixed, his knuckles white, the world around him lurching like a ship in a storm. A low rumble escalated into a deafening roar, and the very air seemed to thrum with a terrifying, unseen power. The farmhouse in the distance shuddered, its windows rattling violently. A picture frame fell from the porch swing, the sound of its shattering glass lost in the cacophony. It felt like it went on forever, a lifetime of being shaken like a rag doll. Every instinct screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to run to. The earth itself was the enemy. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than the noise had been. It was a ringing, buzzing silence that pressed in on his ears. Elias stayed where he was, clinging to the fence post, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He took a deep, shaky breath, the air tasting of dust and fear. Slowly, carefully, he let go of the post, his legs feeling unsteady and foreign. His first thought, the thought that always came first, was for his animals. He scanned the pasture. The cows were huddled together, visibly trembling, but they seemed to be on their feet. That was good. That was something. He began a slow, unsteady walk toward his buildings, his eyes scanning for damage. The old barn, a stoic structure that had weathered 100 storms, had a new crack zigzagging down its stone foundation. One of the loft windows had burst, showering the hayloft with glittering shards of glass. The chicken coop was tilted at a funny angle, a few panicked chickens clucking and fluttering inside. It was a mess, but it was a fixable mess. He had seen worse after a harsh winter or a fierce thunderstorm. He could handle this. He would spend the rest of the day boarding up windows and checking for structural damage. It was just another problem to be solved. It was only as he was walking the perimeter of his property, a habit he'd had since he was a boy, that he saw it. He was tracing the line of the old stone wall that marked the edge of his land. A wall so old that no one in his family could remember who had built it. It was just a part of the landscape, overgrown with moss and lichen, the stones settled and solid. But now, there was a dark line in it, a jagged tear. As he got closer, his heart started to beat a little faster again. The earthquake hadn't just cracked the wall. It had pulled it apart. A section about 10 feet long had split open, and the ground beneath it had collapsed inwards, creating a dark, gaping wound in the earth. He knelt down, his knees protesting with a dull ache. The fissure was about 3 feet wide, and the drop was steep. He peered into the darkness, but it was absolute, a void that seemed to drink the afternoon light. He picked up a loose stone and dropped it into the hole. He listened, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. a faint, distant clack as it hit bottom. It was deeper than he'd thought. The air that drifted up was cool and smelled of damp soil, wet rock, and something else. Something ancient and dry, like the inside of a long-sealed tomb. This was no natural crack. Natural cracks were messy, random things. This was different. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw that the edges of the opening weren't just torn earth. They were lined with stone. Not the rough field stones of the wall above, but cut, fitted blocks, placed there with a clear and deliberate purpose. He leaned in closer, his curiosity warring with a deep-seated caution that had kept him safe his whole life. He pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight function. It's modern. Bright beam, a stark contrast to the ancient darkness below. He played the beam of light along the inside of the opening. The light revealed a square-cut entrance, a perfect, man-made tunnel leading straight down into the ground. The stones were smooth and fitted together with incredible skill. A level of craftsmanship he had only ever seen in old churches or castles, not in a forgotten corner of his own farm. How long had this been here? Under his feet. For generations, his family had plowed this land, walked this land, lived and died on this land, and none of them had ever known. None of them had ever suspected that right here beneath the familiar soil was a secret. He sat back on his heels. The beam of his phone's light cutting a nervous path in the air before him. 100 practical thoughts ran through his mind. It could be dangerous. The ground could be unstable. It could be an old well, a cistern, something best left alone and forgotten. He should just get some gravel and some filled dirt and close it up. Pretend he never saw it. That was the sensible thing to do. The farmer thing to do, but he couldn't. A different feeling was rising up in him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a boy exploring the woods for the first time. It was a pure, unadulterated spark of curiosity. What was down there? Who built it, and why? The questions buzzed in his mind like insistent flies, impossible to swat away. He looked at the dark, silent entrance, and it felt like it was looking back at him, holding its breath, waiting. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he couldn't just fill it in. He had to know. He had to see what was inside. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across his field. But for the first time in his simple, predictable life, Elias wasn't thinking about the end of the day. He was thinking about the beginning of a mystery. The night was a restless one. Elias lay in his bed, the familiar creaks and groans of the old farmhouse sounding different now, more ominous. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it, that perfect square hole of darkness, a void in the middle of his familiar world. He tossed and turned, the practical side of his brain, waging a war with the part of him that was, for the first time in decades, truly alive with curiosity. His father would have known what to do. His father would have gotten the tractor, the backhoe, and a load of gravel, and he would have sealed that thing up before sundown. It was the sensible, the safe, the right thing to do. But every time Elias tried to convince himself of that, the image of those cut stones, placed with a skill that defied the centuries, would flash in his mind. It was a question, and he had never been a man who could leave a question unanswered. By the time the first gray light of dawn filtered through his bedroom window, the decision was made. He wasn't his father. He had to know. He moved through his morning routine with a strange sense of detachment. The coffee tasted bitter. The toast felt like cardboard in his mouth. His mind was already down in that hole, walking that dark corridor. After feeding the animals, a task that usually brought him a sense of peace and order, he headed for the barn. He wasn't a spelunker or an adventurer. He was a farmer. So he gathered farmer's tools. He found a thick, heavy-duty rope, the kind he used for securing heavy loads on his trailer. He tested its strength, pulling on it with all his weight. It would hold. He grabbed his brightest work light, a powerful LED lamp on a long cord that he usually used for fixing the tractor in the dead of winter. He also took a crowbar, its weight a cold comfort in his hand, and a small, dusty first aid kit he'd won at a county fair years ago and never opened. Just in case, he walked back to the fissure, the morning air cool and crisp. The world looked so normal, so peaceful. The birds were singing, the dew was still on the grass, It felt wrong to be doing something so strange on such an ordinary day. He found a sturdy-looking old oak tree near the crack and wrapped the rope around its thick trunk, tying a knot his grandfather had taught him, a knot he knew would not slip. He tossed the other end of the rope into the dark opening. It landed with a soft thud. He took a deep breath, the smell of damp earth rising up to meet him. "This is foolish," he muttered to himself. But he clipped the heavy worklight to his belt, tested its switch, and, gripping the rope tightly, began to lower himself into the ground. The descent was awkward and nerve-wracking. The rope bit into his hands, and his boots scraped against the stone sides of the shaft. The world above shrank to a small circle of blue sky, and then it was gone, replaced by a suffocating absolute darkness. He switched on the worklight. Its powerful beam cut a brilliant white path through the gloom, illuminating the walls around him. Up close, the craftsmanship was even more astonishing. The stones were massive, yet they were fitted together with such precision that he couldn't slide a credit card between them. There was no mortar holding them, just the perfect, interlocking weight of the stone. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was built to last, to be hidden. His feet touched solid ground. He unclipped himself from the rope and stood for a moment, just listening. The silence was a physical presence, thick and heavy. The only sound was the hum of his own blood in his ears and the faint buzz from the LED light. He played the beam of light down the tunnel, stretched straight ahead, a perfect geometric line disappearing into an inky blackness. The air was still and cold, and it carried that same dry, ancient scent he'd noticed before, like old paper in forgotten places. He took his first step, then another. His footsteps echoed softly, the sound swallowed by the immense weight of the earth above him. He swept the light back and forth across the walls. That's when he saw them. Carvings. They were faint, almost worn away by time, but they were definitely there. They weren't letters or numbers from any language he knew. They were a series of strange, flowing symbols interwoven with geometric patterns. Some looked like stylized stars, others like plants or animals, but twisted into unnatural shapes. They were beautiful and unsettling all at once. He ran his calloused fingers over one of the carvings, feeling the cool, smooth stone. Who had taken the time to do this? And what did it all mean? He forced himself to keep moving, his heart a steady drum against his ribs. The tunnel seemed to go on forever. Every 10 feet or so, he would see another section of carvings, each one slightly different from the last. He felt like he was walking into a different world, a place that operated by a completely different set of rules than the one he knew. He was just a simple man who grew corn and raised cows. He had no business being in a place like this. The feeling of being an intruder grew stronger with every step he took. He had walked what he guessed was a couple of 100 feet when his light caught something on the floor ahead. It wasn't a stone. It was a different shape, a different texture. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He slowly moved the beam of light forward. There, lying in the middle of the tunnel, as if it had been dropped just a moment ago, was a single leather boot. It was an old-fashioned boot, made of a dark, thick leather that had been polished to a shine long ago. It was in almost perfect condition, completely out of place in the dusty, ancient tunnel. The laces were still tied, as if the person wearing it had simply vanished, leaving their footwear behind. He knelt down, his knees protesting on the hard stone floor. He reached out a trembling hand, but stopped just short of touching it. It felt too personal, too sacred. He just stared at it. Who did this belong to? Where did they go? Did they take it off and walk away barefoot? Or did something happen to them? The questions piled up in his mind, each one more unnerving than the last. The sight of that single lonely boot was more chilling than any monster or any ghost story he had ever heard. It was real. It was a piece of a life that had been interrupted in this very spot centuries ago. A cold dread began to creep up his spine, a primal fear that told him he was not alone, that he was being watched by the eyes of history. The air suddenly felt colder, the silence more menacing. The powerful beam of his work light felt small and insignificant against the vast, pressing darkness. He stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the boot. He had seen enough for one day. Curiosity was still there, a burning ember in his gut, but it was now smothered by a thick layer of caution and a healthy dose of fear. He was a farmer, not an archaeologist, and he was in way over his head. He backed away slowly, not wanting to turn his back on the boot, until it was swallowed by the darkness. Then he turned and walked quickly, his footsteps echoing with a new sense of urgency. The climb out was faster than the descent. He didn't stop to look at the carvings, just pulled hand over hand, his muscles straining, till his head broke the surface and he was back in the familiar world of sun and sky. He collapsed onto the grass, his chest heaving, sucking in great lungfuls of fresh, clean air. The world looked exactly the same as it had when he'd left it, but he knew it wasn't. It had changed, or maybe he had changed. He looked at the dark opening at his feet, no longer just a hole in the ground, but a doorway to a mystery that was far bigger and deeper than he could have ever imagined. He knew he couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe him? And more importantly, he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that he had to go back, but not alone. The thought of going back down there alone was a non-starter. The memory of that single lonely boot lying in the dust like a question mark had chased away the last of his bravado. Fear was a cold, hard knot in his stomach, but it was tangled up with a need for answers that was just as powerful. He needed a witness. He needed someone else to see this, to tell him he wasn't going crazy. There was only one person he could think of. Arthur lived on the next farm over, a sprawling, kept piece of land that was the complete opposite of Elias's more ramshackle operation. Arthur was a man of facts and figures, of soil pH and market prices. He was practical to a fault and didn't have much time for anything that couldn't be measured or sold. If Elias told him he'd found a mysterious tunnel, Arthur would likely tell him he'd found a sinkhole and offer to help him fill it in. But he was also an honest man, and he had been Elias's neighbor for 30 years. He was the only one Elias trusted with something this strange. He found Arthur in his workshop, meticulously sharpening a plow blade. The smell of oil and hot metal filled the air. Elias leaned against the doorframe, feeling a bit foolish. "Arthur," he started, his voice sounding more hesitant than he'd intended. "Got a minute?" Arthur looked up, his face a mask of concentration. "For you, Elias. What's on your mind? Your tractor acting up again?" "No, nothing like that." Elias took a deep breath. "You're not going to believe this. In fact, I'm not sure I believe it, and I saw it with my own eyes." He laid it all out, as simply and as calmly as he could. The earthquake, the crack in the old wall, the perfectly cut stones, the tunnel, the strange carvings on the walls, and finally, the boot. As he spoke, Arthur stopped his work and just listened, his expression slowly shifting from patient amusement to a deep, skeptical frown. He didn't interrupt. He just let Elias talk, his eyes narrowing slightly. When Elias was finished, Arthur was silent for a long moment. He wiped his hands on an oily rag and tossed it onto his workbench. "A hidden tunnel," he said, his voice flat. "Under the old wall. With carvings? In a single boot?" "That's right," Elias said, feeling a defensive heat rise in his cheeks. "Elias, have you been hitting the hard cider a bit early this season?" Arthur asked, not unkindly, but with the bluntness of a man who had no time for nonsense. "An earthquake can do strange things. It probably just opened up an old root cellar or cistern from the last century. The boot could have fallen in from a hole in the ground years ago. It wasn't a root cellar." Arthur Elias insisted, his voice firm. "The stonework, it's like nothing I've ever seen. It's old. Older than the farmhouse. Older than anything around here and the air down there. It feels dead. Like a tomb." Arthur studied his friend's face. He saw the genuine confusion and the underlying fear in Elias's eyes. He knew Elias wasn't a man who made things up. He was about as down-to-earth as a person could get. The skepticism in Arthur's eyes didn't vanish, but it was replaced by a flicker of something else. Curiosity. "All right," he said, sighing as if he was agreeing to a terrible bargain. "Let's go see your mysterious tunnel. But if I find out you've just dragged me away from my work to look at a hole in the ground, you're buying me dinner." The walk back to the fissure was quiet. Arthur kept glancing at Elias, half expecting him to break into a laugh and admit it was all a joke. But Elias's face was a mask of grim determination. When they reached the crack in the earth, Arthur just stood there for a moment, peering down into the darkness. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, his voice filled with a new kind of surprise. "That's not a sinkhole." Elias had brought 2 powerful work lights this time. He handed one to Arthur. "I'll go first. Just follow me down, and watch your step." The descent was easier with 2 lights pushing back the darkness. When Arthur's feet touched the bottom, he immediately shone his light on the walls, his breath catching in his throat. He ran his hand over the smooth, perfectly fitted stones, just as Elias had done. "Be damned," he whispered, his skepticism finally melting away in the face of undeniable proof. "This is incredible." They walked down the tunnel in silence, their lights dancing ahead of them. Arthur pointed out the carvings, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I've never seen anything like these symbols. Not in any book." He was a man who respected good work, and this was some of the best work he had ever seen. They reached the spot where Elias had found the boot. It was still there, lying exactly as he had left it, a perfect, solitary artifact in the middle of the stone floor. Arthur knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't touch it, just stared at it. "He's not coming back for it, is he?" he said softly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. The silence that followed was heavy with the unspoken history of the place. The reality of it, the sheer, overwhelming age of it, was settling in on both of them. "Come on," Elias said, his voice a little shaky. "The tunnel doesn't end here." They continued on, their footsteps echoing in a steady, rhythmic beat. The air grew colder, and the strange, dry scent was stronger. Finally, about 100 feet further on, the tunnel opened up. It wasn't a gradual widening. It was a sudden, dramatic end to the passage. They stepped out of the confines of the tunnel and into a space so vast that their lights seemed small and weak. Unable to reach the distant walls, it was a massive, circular chamber carved out of the solid rock of the earth. The ceiling was high above them, lost in shadow. The air was perfectly still, a pocket of time that had remained undisturbed for centuries. And it was not empty. Their lights swept across the scene, revealing a sight that stole the air from their lungs. It wasn't a treasure room filled with gold and jewels. It was something else, something far more profound. It was the ghost of a life frozen in time. Several long, wooden trestle tables stood in the center of the room. On one of them, clay inkwells sat next to carefully bound stacks of manuscripts. Their pages yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved. Quill pens lay beside them, as if their owners had just set them down for a moment. On another table, intricate metalworking tools were arranged neatly, alongside half-finished projects made of a strange, dark metal that didn't rust. Carved into the curved stone walls were shelves, and on those shelves were more wonders. Rows of sealed ceramic jars, their contents a mystery. Delicate astronomical instruments made of polished brass and what looked like crystal, and most stunning of all, large sheets of cured hide stretched flat, on which were etched breathtakingly detailed star charts, showing constellations they didn't recognize and celestial bodies they couldn't name. Arthur walked over to one of the tables, his movements slow and reverent. He picked up one of the bound manuscripts, his hands trembling slightly. He carefully opened it. The pages were filled with the same strange, flowing symbols they had seen on the tunnel walls. But here they were organized into neat lines and paragraphs. "Elias," Arthur breathed, his voice filled with a sense of awe that Elias had never heard from him before. "This isn't just a hiding place. This was a library. A workshop, eh? A whole world." Elias's light was drawn to the very center of the chamber. There, on a raised stone dais, sat a single ornate chest. It was made of a dark, rich wood, bound with intricately worked metal. It was the only thing in the entire room that looked like a traditional treasure chest, and its lid was slightly ajar, as if beckoning them closer, promising to reveal the final, most important secret of this incredible forgotten place. They stood there, two simple farmers in a hidden chamber under a field, staring at a chest that held the story of who these people were and why they had vanished from the face of the earth. The two farmers stood in the center of the silent, circular chamber, their work lights casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel alive. The air was so still, it felt like a solid thing, heavy with the weight of centuries. Their eyes were fixed on the ornate chest sitting on the stone dais. It was the one thing in the entire room that looked like it belonged in a storybook. A promise of answers, a final, neat conclusion to the mystery. Arthur took a half step toward it, his hand outstretched, but then he stopped. Shouldn't, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Yet it echoed in the profound silence. Elias nodded, his throat tight. He knew Arthur was right. It felt wrong, like trespassing in a church. This wasn't a forgotten root cellar, or a place where someone had hidden a few coins. This was a tomb, not for bodies, but for knowledge, for a whole way of life that had been erased from history. To open that chest, to touch those things, felt like a violation. They were farmers. They understood the sacredness of things left to rest, like a field left fallow to regain its strength. This place had been left fallow for a very long time. What do we do then? Elias asked, the question hanging in the cold air. We can't just leave it. An earthquake could finish the job. This whole place could come down. Arthur ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration and awe. He looked around at the shelves, at the tables, at the incredible, impossible star charts. His practical, fact-based brain was struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. We're not the right men for this, Elias, he said, his voice firm with a new certainty. This is for people with degrees. People who know what these symbols mean. We're just going to mess it up. We could damage something just by breathing on it the wrong way. Elias felt a pang of something like disappointment. He had discovered it. It was on his land. A part of him wanted to be the one to solve it, to be the hero of his own story. But looking at Arthur's face, he knew his friend was right. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, the heavy burden of responsibility lifting slightly. He was in over his head, and it was okay to admit it. So who? Elias asked. The police. They'll just rope it off and call it a hazard. The Historical Society? Arthur suggested, then shook his head. No, they're good with old houses and Civil War uniforms. This is older. Much older. They both stood in silence for a moment, the answer dawning on them at the same time. The university, Elias said. The university, Arthur agreed. They'll have an archaeology department, or history, or something. They have people who study this kind of thing for a living. Getting back to the surface felt like returning from another planet. The bright afternoon sun was a shock. The sounds of the farm, the distant lowing of a cow, the chirping of a sparrow, seemed strangely loud and ordinary. They sat on the tailgate of Arthur's truck, the reality of what they had just seen sinking in. It was Arthur who made the call. He paced back and forth in the dirt, his phone pressed to his ear, trying to explain the unexplainable to a series of bored-sounding receptionists. No, I'm not kidding, he said for the third time, his patience wearing thin. Look, can you just put me through to someone? Anyone in the archaeology or ancient history department? This is important. He was finally transferred to a young-sounding man who was polite but clearly dismissive. Sir, we get calls like this all the time. People find old bottles, interesting-looking rocks. While we appreciate your enthusiasm, we can't send a professor out for every potential discovery. It's not a rock. Arthur practically shouted into the phone, then took a deep breath. Look, my friend has a tunnel on his property. A stone tunnel. It leads to a chamber. A chamber filled with stuff. Old stuff. Manuscripts. Star charts. Things that shouldn't be here. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. A chamber? Filled with manuscripts? The voice on the line was suddenly more interested. That's right, Arthur said, sensing a shift. Can you describe the script on the manuscripts? The voice asked. Oh, I don't know. It's not English. It's not anything I've ever seen. It's all curves and dots and... Look, Can you just send someone? We're not crazy. We're just two farmers who found something we can't explain. Another pause. My name is Dr. Vance. I'm a junior fellow in the Department of Ancient Languages. I can't promise anything, but your description is intriguing. I have some free time tomorrow afternoon. Can you text me the address? I'll come out and take a look. But I'm warning you, my expectations are very low. The next day passed in a blur of nervous energy for Elias. He walked around his farm, doing his chores, but his mind was a million miles underground. He kept expecting Dr. Vance to call and cancel, to say it was all a waste of time. But around 2 o'clock, a dusty, sensible-looking sedan pulled into his driveway. A woman got out. She was younger than he expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp, cane-intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense way about her. She wore practical trousers and a field jacket, and she carried a large canvas bag over her shoulder. This was Dr. Vance. You must be Elias, she said, her handshake firm and brief. And you're Arthur. You said on the phone you found something. We did, Arthur said. But you have to see it to believe it. Dr. Vance followed them across the field, her expression one of polite skepticism. So, an earthquake revealed this? She asked, her eyes scanning the ground. That's right, Elias said. Right at the base of the old wall. When they reached the fissure, Dr. Vance knelt down, peering into the darkness. She took a small, powerful flashlight from her bag and shone it inside. Elias watched her face, expecting to see a flicker of excitement. But her expression remained neutral, professional. Stonework looks old, she commented, her voice calm. Could be 18th or 19th century. Maybe a smuggler's tunnel, or a cold cellar for a large house that once stood here. She was already trying to fit it into a neat, logical box. It's older than that, Elias said quietly. They descended into the tunnel. Dr. Vance moving with a confident ease that the two farmers lacked. She swept her light along the walls, her professional mask finally slipping when she saw the carvings. She stopped dead in her tracks. She breathed, her voice filled with a new kind of energy. She ran her fingers lightly over the symbols, her touch as reverent as Elias's had been. This is not 19th century. This is not anything I've ever seen in situ. She pulled a small camera from her bag and began taking photos, muttering to herself. The line work, the composition. It's proto-Kimric, but with elements that are impossible, absolutely impossible. They reached the chamber. When Dr. Vance stepped out of the tunnel and her light illuminated the vast space, she made a small, choked sound. She just stood there for a full minute, her light beam slowly panning across the tables. The shelves, the incredible silent library. Her skepticism was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Hey, this can't be real, she whispered, walking toward one of the tables as if in a trance. She pulled a pair of white cotton gloves from her bag. With trembling hands, she carefully picked up one of the bound manuscripts. The binding, the vellum, the preservation is perfect. No. She gently opened it. The script. It's a variant of the script in the tunnel, but more developed. It's a dialect we thought was purely theoretical, a lost branch of a language that died out over 1,000 years ago. We have fragments, a few potsherds with similar marks, but nothing like this. Nothing whole. She looked up at Elias and Arthur, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying excitement. Do you understand what this is? This isn't just a collection of old things. This is a repository, a time capsule. This could rewrite everything. She carefully took a tiny pair of tweezers and a small vial from her bag. She delicately plucked a single loose thread from the manuscript's binding and placed it inside. I need to get this dated, but I don't need to wait for the results. I know, I can feel it. This is ancient. She was already pulling out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. I need to call my department head. No, the dean. This is the find of a lifetime. Of several lifetimes. She looked around the chamber, a laugh of pure disbelief escaping her lips. You too, she said, pointing at them with her phone. You have no idea what you've found. The world is about to come knocking on your door, and it is never going to leave. Elias and Arthur stood there, watching the excited scholar make her call, feeling the ground shift under their feet for the second time in a week. Their quiet, simple lives were over. They were no longer just farmers. They were the guardians of a secret that was about to stun the entire world. The world arrived the next morning. It didn't come with a bang, but with the quiet, persistent rumble of tires on gravel and the organized beeping of a large truck backing up. Elias stood on his porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, and watched as his quiet farm was transformed into a bustling makeshift research site. A large white tent was erected over the fissure, a sterile modern structure squatting awkwardly on the ancient earth. People in clean, practical clothes unloaded crates of equipment. There were lights, cameras, computers, and things Elias couldn't even begin to name. He felt like a stranger in his own home. Dr. Vance was in her element, directing the small army of experts with a focused energy. She introduced Elias and Arthur to a few of them, a quiet man who was an expert in ancient materials, a woman with kind eyes who was a specialist in deciphering lost languages. They all treated the two farmers with a respect that felt slightly surreal, nodding to them as if they were colleagues, not just men who happened to own the land. But Elias could see the truth in their eyes. They were looking through him at the ground beneath his feet. He and Arthur were just the gatekeepers to the real show. Over the next few days, the farm became a place of hushed, urgent discovery. The chamber was declared a controlled environment. Anyone who entered had to wear special suits and booties. Elias and Arthur were allowed in, but only to watch from a designated spot. They saw the team carefully cataloging every single item, photographing the manuscripts from every angle, and taking tiny samples for testing. The air, once still and silent, was now filled with the quiet click-clack of laptop keyboards and the low murmur of people speaking in a language of academic jargon that was as foreign to the farmers as the symbols. On the walls, the focus of everyone's attention, however, remained on the chest on the dais. No one had touched it yet. They were waiting for a specific expert, a historian who had flown in from across the country to oversee the opening. When she finally arrived, a sharp, known-sense woman named Dr. Albright, the energy in the chamber crackled with anticipation. Elias and Arthur stood back. Feeling like they were watching a sacred ceremony, Dr. Albright, with gloved hands, approached the chest. She didn't just pull it open. She used tiny, delicate tools to probe the edges, checking for traps or mechanisms that might damage the contents. Finally, satisfied, she carefully lifted the heavy lid. There was no pile of gold, no glittering jewels. The chest was lined with a faded, velvet-like material. Nestled inside were a collection of smaller, leather-bound books and a large folded sheet of what looked like cured animal hide. They were diaries, and a map. Dr. Vance was the first to pick up one of the diaries. She handled it as if it were made of glass. "This is it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The story. In their own words, the deciphering began in earnest. It was a painstaking process, but the team worked around the clock, comparing the script in the diaries to the symbols on the walls and the manuscripts. Elias and Arthur would just sit and watch, fascinated by the way the scholars would huddle together, pointing at a page, arguing softly, and then having a sudden shared breakthrough. It was 2 days later when Dr. Vance called them over. Her face was pale, her eyes shining with a light that was a mixture of excitement and sheer disbelief. "We have it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We have the beginning of the story." She read a translated passage aloud. It was written by the leader of the group, a man who called himself the Keeper. He spoke of their home, a thriving city-state by the sea, a place of art and science. But their society was torn apart by a new, fanatical ruler who feared knowledge. He believed that their understanding of the stars, their advanced metalworking, and their ideas about governing themselves were a threat to the gods and to his power. He started a purge, Dr. Vance explained, her voice low. He called their knowledge heresy. He burned their libraries and executed their scholars. This group, she gestured around the chamber, was a small band of the brightest minds who escaped. They built this place not to hide treasure, but to hide ideas. She read another passage. It described their last days on the surface, their sorrow at leaving their homes, their hope that one day the world would be ready for their knowledge again. Elias felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't a story about ancient kings or battles. It was a story about people, just like him, who were scared, who were losing everything, and who were trying to save something they believed was precious. But the final, stunning revelation came when they carefully unrolled the large map. It wasn't a map of the local area. It was a map of a vast coastline they didn't recognize, with detailed markings of cities and mountains. But it was what was drawn in the corner of the map that made the historians gasp. It was a detailed diagram of the solar system, showing the sun at the center with all the planets, including the distant ones only visible with a telescope. Orbiting around it, they knew, Dr. Albright said, sinking into a chair, her face ashen. They knew the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. They knew this over 1,000 years before Galileo. The implications were staggering. This one discovery, this hidden chamber under a farmer's field, proved that a society with a Renaissance-level understanding of science, astronomy, and philosophy had existed centuries, perhaps a millennium, before the European Renaissance. Everything the history books taught about the slow, steady march of human progress was wrong. It wasn't a march. It was a series of fits and starts, of brilliant lights being extinguished by ignorance and fear. In the days that followed, the story broke. News helicopters circled overhead and reporters camped at the end of his driveway. Elias's life was no longer his own. But he found a strange peace in the chaos. He would often walk out to the edge of the tent, looking at the ground, and think about the people below. He didn't understand the star charts or the complex philosophy in the books, but he understood the diary entry about the last harvest they tended before they went into hiding. He understood their hope. One evening after the last of the experts had left for the day, he stood alone in his field. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the land. He looked at the tilled earth, at the crops he had planted. He was still just a farmer, but he was no longer just a man who worked the land. He was a caretaker of a forgotten dream, a guardian of a light that had almost gone out. The people in that chamber had tried to save the world, and in the end, all they had saved was themselves. But now, 1,000 years later, their work was finally done. And Elias, with his simple, honest heart, felt a profound connection to them across the centuries. He was part of their story now, and they were part of his.